Hi everyone, it's Katrina. Number 10. Death photography. In the Victorian era, there was a lot of death happening and people were obsessed. Disease ravaged the world on an unprecedented scale. During the first half of the 19th century, life expectancy was around 40. Most people did not live longer than 4 decades, stricken down by anything from typhoid to scarlet fever to tuberculosis to cholera. This was a time before vaccines and antibiotics. A simple sickness frequently led to death. There was an extremely high mortality rate for infants. Everywhere you looked, somebody was dead or dying. During this time of strife, people came up with creative yet eccentric ways to remember their deceased loved ones. One of the ways that caught on with unexpected force was Victorian death photos. It seems disgusting to people now, but Victorian families were in love with the idea. When somebody close to them died, they used their corpse in a photo shoot. The proper name is post-mortem photography. It's more casually known as death photography. In the first half of the 19th century, photography was a new and exciting invention. Many people who took photos of the dead had likely never taken a picture of anything else. Those who could afford it in Victorian England tried to capture the biggest moments of their lives on film. But cameras weren't exactly portable. If somebody wanted to get a photo shoot done, they generally went to a professional. With the invention of photography, parents had an opportunity to memorialize their recently deceased children. Some women would go straight from giving birth to a stillborn baby to a photography session. Many of the most famous death photographs feature mothers cradling deceased kids or a grieving father standing over his child's deathbed. It wasn't as macabre as it sounds. Professional photographers quickly learned how to promote their business as something sweet and peaceful. The photograph of a recently deceased family member could often bring comfort to those grieving. English author Mary Russell Mitford wrote in 1842 that her father looked heavenly calm in his death photo. Death photos became so popular that when someone died, the family went to work preparing a place in the house for their post-mortem photograph to be taken. Entire families would pose with the dead. And now for number 9. But first, it's shout-out time! I want to give a big thank you to Jorge Gonzalez Larramendi for the super thanks and for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you are new here to join the Origins Explained family. Number 9. Tear catchers. The tradition of catching tears in a bottle has been around for over 3,000 years. In Middle Eastern societies, it was common to collect the tears of a grief-stricken person inside a special bottle known as a lacrimatory. They would then be put inside the burial tombs as a sign of respect to the dead. Tear bottles were popular during Roman times too. Mourners at a funeral would fill small vials with their own tears and offer them to the deceased. In ancient Rome, it was said women could even make a living from going to a funeral and crying into cups as they walked along the procession route. Legend has it the women who cried the loudest and produced the most tears made the most money. Tear collection is even mentioned briefly in the Old Testament. In Psalm 56:8, David talks about putting his tears in a bottle as a way to preserve his suffering. During the Victorian period of the 19th century, tear bottles made a big comeback. It became common for mourners to collect any tears they shed during a funeral inside an ornately decorated vial. These were normally beautiful bottles made of silver and pewter. They even had special stoppers so that the tears didn't evaporate too quickly. But rather than placing the tear bottles inside of a coffin or a grave, the mourning family members held on to their own vials. They watched the tears until they evaporated completely from the bottle. Only then were they allowed to stop mourning. While this bizarre funerary custom was happening in England, something similar was catching on in America. During the Civil War, women were said to have cried into bottles and then saved their tears until their spouses came home from the war. The women would then present the tear vials to their returned husbands as a symbol of their love. What do you think, romantic or creepy? Let me know in the comments. Number 8. The leech craze. In the 1800s, the English were obsessed with leeches. It's true that leeches have been used as a form of medicine since the days of ancient Egypt, but the wormy bloodsuckers took on a whole new level of importance in Victorian England. People made a career out of collecting leeches from swampy backwaters and selling them to medical professionals. Why did people think leeches were so helpful? For thousands of years, it was believed sickness resided in the blood. The reason a person was mentally ill or physically sick was that their blood wasn't pure. This spawned the practice of bloodletting. Doctors would carefully cut a patient open to try and drain as much blood as possible. It was a ghoulish thing to do, though, and patients could die. Leeches were a much more elegant way to sap a person of their life force. Leech use continued on and off until it exploded at the end of the 1700s. This was thanks to French physician François-Joseph Victor Broussais. He made the outrageous claim that all diseases were the product of inflammation and could be cured through blood-sucking. Bloodletting caught on in a way it never had before and spread across the globe. Leeches were collected by the tens of thousands in American swamps and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. There were so many leeches being bred in Europe that England started importing them from France. Doctors needed so many leeches, the world could hardly keep up with the supply. Worse than being the patient of a leech doctor was being the guy responsible for collecting leeches. These were typically poor people in America who waded into bogs and ponds to collect the vicious animals. They would either use their own legs to attract leeches or old horse legs. Then they would pluck them off their own skin and collect them in a bucket. But this was a lot more dangerous than people realized at the time. Leech collectors would allow the monsters to suck their blood for about 20 minutes because then they were easier to detach. Of course, because they're full. But the collector would keep bleeding after, leaking blood into the swamp from 24 wounds on their legs. Many people who did this suffered serious illnesses and died. People would come home with severe blood loss after a day of collecting. The leech craze only came to an end because it was too difficult to keep farming leeches. They had been drained from nearly every swamp where they lived. Leeches were so effectively pillaged from their natural environment, people thought they had gone extinct until leeches were rediscovered in the 1970s. Plus, shipping them across the ocean became way too expensive. Number 7. Mummy powder. Galen was a Roman physician who lived in the 2nd century AD. In one of his books on medicine, he described how the best cure for epilepsy and arthritis was an elixir made from burned human bones. In the early 16th century, Swiss alchemist Paracelsus wrote that the best medicine for a man comes from another man's body. Paracelsus insisted that human blood, dung, and fat can be used to treat certain illnesses. For thousands of years, the human body has been used to create outrageous medicines. You can understand then why Victorian people were so obsessed with using crushed-up bits of Egyptian mummies as health potions. It was a big thing in Victorian England, but it started many years earlier. Mummia started as a mineral pitch in Arabia. It was likely bitumen taken from the Dead Sea and had nothing to do with mummies. Greeks and medieval Europeans used the mineral pitch in various medicines. Apothecaries sold it as a very expensive cure-all for healing just about any ailment. Persians even used it as an aphrodisiac. But then something really strange happened in the 12th century. The supply of natural bitumen ran short. People in Western Europe started to think the word mummia came from the word mummy. In a very short span of time, natural bitumen transformed into powdered human mummy dust. Grave robbers started scraping black resin from embalmed Egyptian mummies and selling it in apothecaries. It became such a big problem that Egypt outlawed the shipment of mummia in the 16th century. Back in Europe, embalmers started desiccating local corpses just to get their hands on some of that sweet human powder. Physicians got together and agreed mummia was a translation mistake at the beginning of the 17th century. But mummia continued to be used well into the 19th century despite being an ineffective drug. For a brief time, artists were also grinding mummy resin to use in popular oil paint. There was nothing that good old mummy powder couldn't do. Number 6. The Sin Eater. There was a big problem in Victorian Britain with people dying full of sin. It was common for a man or a woman on their deathbed to unburden themselves to a priest. The priest would then absolve that person of their wrongdoings, and they could fade away into the afterlife knowing they would go to heaven. But the priests weren't always a sure thing, and sometimes the person died without being able to confess. When a soul was on the line, the sin eater came to amend the situation. The sin eater's sole responsibility was to eat a ritual meal at the funeral of a recently deceased person. The food was believed to absorb all the sins of the dead. When the sin eater had consumed the meal, they were seen as having consumed the sins of the person who had passed on. That person was then able to continue their journey after death without the stain of sin on their soul. Eating sins was not the best job a person could have. The issue with gobbling up so many sins was that you started to take on a kind of taint. Sin eaters, although extremely important to communities, quickly became outcasts. It was believed the sin eater contained all the sins of the people they'd absolved. They were walking around with all those sins inside of them like excess gas. For this reason, they soon became shunned and ignored. People feared sin eaters, and yet they needed them all the time. This kind of paranoid duality was very typical of the Victorian era. But just how common was the practice? In the 1800s, sin eaters were popular in Scotland, Ireland, and especially Wales. The Welsh had a real obsession with sin and getting rid of it, but sin eaters have been around a lot longer. The Aztec goddess Tlazolteotl may have been the first sin eater in the Americas. It was believed the goddess would cleanse the soul by eating its filth. Jesus of Nazareth was also considered a sin eater for absorbing the sins of all humanity. In Victorian Britain, the only place where sin eating didn't get popular was England. There were a few towns along the Welsh border that practiced sin eating, but it failed to spread to London. Catherine Sinclair, the famous Scottish novelist, wrote that the practice was in decline in 1838. The only ones willing to consume the sins of a stranger's soul were beggars and desperate infidels. That's according to Catherine, anyway. Number 5. Victorian mourning rituals. Mourning the death of a loved one in Victorian England required a significant amount of etiquette. This was especially true for the women of the time. Women were required to wear proper mourning clothes, to have a very lavish funeral, and to refrain from social interactions. It was customary to place an ornate monument on the grave and then stay home in the dark for a certain amount of time. But the rules were complicated. There were household manuals and popular journals that told people what they were supposed to wear depending on who died. For example, The Queen and Cassell's were two popular Victorian journals among housewives. These journals gave instructions on every eventuality, from the death of a husband to the death of a second cousin. Mourning clothes started as a deep black to be symbolic of the darkness after death. The typical Victorian mourning clothes were elegant, and they changed as the mourning went on. The clothing started black and transitioned into gray. The clothes would eventually turn white when the grieving period was done. Men had it particularly easy because they only had to wear dark suits. But it was the length of mourning that was particularly complex. A widow was expected to go into total isolation and wear full mourning clothes for 2 years. If a child lost a parent, or if a parent lost a child, the mourning time was only half. Siblings only had to mourn one another for 6 months. If you lost an aunt or an uncle, it was only 2 months. And if your cousin perished in an unfortunate accident, you only had to mourn them for about 4 weeks. It's worth mentioning how big of a business mourning was in Victorian England. Every conceivable item of clothing was provided by clothing shops that specialized in mourning apparel. Because rumors spread that it was bad luck to wear the same mourning clothes twice, people had to buy a new set every time they lost someone close to them. This was huge money for the suppliers. Number 4. Arsenic everywhere. During the Victorian era, domestic poison spread through just about every home in London. Arsenic rapidly became one of the most widely used ingredients in dye. In 1778, arsenic was used as a pigment in the famous shade Shields green. Then, in 1814, it was used in emerald and brilliant green, two of the most popular colors for domestic painting. In the early 1800s, scientists understood the danger of arsenic. Multiple pamphlets were released by the scientific press. Those who understood the danger of the poison published papers on the subject. Mr. Henry Carr collected evidence of those who met their death at the hands of the poison. One of his most tragic cases was of a child in Peckham who died after sucking on a piece of wallpaper. Another person who wore stockings painted with arsenic had what looked like chemical burns on her legs. Those who wore green gloves had their hands swell to balloons, and those who painted their nurseries with arsenic wallpaper often had their children sent to the morgue soon after. But here's the thing about Victorian England: nobody cared about the arsenic. Even with all these scientific papers being published, people continued to purchase green wallpaper infused with arsenic because it was the fashion style of the time. People were more concerned about fashion than they were about dying miserably. Arsenic did eventually go away. The workers who made the goods started to get really sick. People's skin was falling off and they were getting horribly ill. Many suffered ulcerations and many more died. Young girls working with artificial flowers were another of the casualties of the business. By the end of the 1800s, the public did begin to demand safer products. Legislation was brought in to get rid of arsenic in the home. Number 3. Funeral customs. A Victorian funeral was a very special occasion. Many of the funeral customs in early America weren't very different from the ones we still practice today. At the same time, some were so bizarre, you'll hardly believe they were real. Most often, the funeral for a recently departed loved one was held in the home of the deceased. It wasn't a closed affair, but open to the public. Friends and family could show up, and so could anyone off the street. There were people who would wander around at random funerals because it was an exciting affair. Folks couldn't just sit at home and watch TV, so they had to find entertainment any way they could. At these home funerals, the body would be displayed in the front parlor. Sometimes they would be placed in their own bedroom. If the person was shown in a funeral parlor instead of their own home, locals would assume the deceased hadn't had enough friends or family members to organize the service. And this could be a humiliating thing for the recently dead. Instead of saying your respects to an open coffin, people would be allowed to sit with the deceased. It could be an all-night extravaganza. Loved ones would sit with the rotting corpse through the night to help ward off evil spirits. There weren't any displays of flowers. Sometimes a deceased woman would be buried with just a single flower pinched between her fingers. There also weren't any coffins. The body would typically be wrapped in a blanket or a quilt and then buried in the ground. The first coffins in America during the Victorian era didn't come until very late in the 1800s, and they were usually made from hollowed-out tree trunks. Number 2. The Mask of Death. The ancient Egyptians used death masks in ritual ceremonies following the death of somebody important. It was part of the mummification process to place a fancy death mask onto the mummy's head. In Rome, elite men had their faces immortalized in plaster casts. After the death of an emperor or a member of the nobility, a plaster mold of their head would be put on display outside the family's atrium. The public could stroll along and take a look at the molding of the dead guy's head. This continued from the 2nd century BC until around 500 AD. Then, in the Middle Ages, important people started having their faces cast in plaster and bronze. After they died, their masks were kept safe in libraries and museums. Anyone who was of any importance had their face memorialized in a death mask. King Henry VIII, Beethoven, Napoleon, poet John Keats, and even Nikola Tesla. Joseph Stalin's death mask is still on display at the Stalin Museum in Georgia. For a brief amount of time in the Victorian era, death masks were all the rage. It was the only way people had of keeping the image of a dead loved one around after they were gone. Getting a plaster mold of someone's dead face was the first version of the death photograph. People only stopped collecting death masks in the 1800s when post-mortem photography became available. Would you want a death mask when you pass? Let me know in the comments. Number 1. Hair jewelry. One of the strangest fashion fads you don't see much more of these days is hair jewelry. It was all the rage in the Victorian era and dates back much further. Starting in the Middle Ages, hair became something you could remember a dead person by. It was too difficult to keep body parts because they rotted. Fingernails are gross, and teeth are kind of gross too. People started to cut locks of hair from their dead loved ones and then fashion them into pieces of jewelry. A thick braid of hair would be neatly patterned inside a brooch or a pendant, then worn by the mourner. The explosion of popularity in the Victorian period was thanks to Queen Victoria herself. Queen Victoria offered a bracelet made from her own hair to Napoleon III's wife, Empress Eugenie, as a gift. This inspired other women to do the same, and soon Europe was overflowing with hair jewelry. There were markets where you could trade long curls of hair for ribbons and trinkets. Hair started to be used in all forms of artwork and crafts. Watch chains, bracelets, cufflinks, earrings, everything you can think of. Postcards with locks of hair inside them became popular. Young women would send strands of their hair in Valentine's cards as sentimental presents. People made hair albums. Imagine a family photo album, except instead of pictures, every page is a different family member's hair. Hair albums became heirlooms passed down through generations. Even with the rise of death photography, hair jewelry had a special place in Victorian life. Then, right around the turn of the century, people started to get grossed out by it, and the fad ended. Thanks for watching! Which of these Victorian obsessions do you think was the weirdest of them all? Which one did you actually like? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!